pleasure to see so many friends of SIPA and students. And I think I see some individuals from across the campus here today, and very pleased to see that. Tonight's discussion is part of our Tech and Policy Speaker Series, and I can't imagine anyone more appropriate to engage that crucial intersection than Bruce Schneier, who is with us this evening. Bruce Schneier has been thinking about security for a very long time. He's written 14 books on the subject, new one coming out, which I have yet to read. So I'm very excited to have a conversation with him tonight about how he's thinking about technology and security and public policy today. I think it's a very different conversation than it was a few years ago, and it continues to be increasingly important. SIPA is a school of international public affairs that I think is increasingly recognizing the importance of blending fields to deal with public policy challenges today. And so I think more and more of our students are developing a technology background, also trying to use technology to advance their entrepreneurial interests in core areas of their public policy passions. And certainly cybersecurity is an area that is one of those fields. Ours is an area historically of great strength in nuclear theory, in security studies broadly, and it seems to me the right place to expand into cybersecurity as well, because you can't do that unless you have a great school of data science and engineering, which we have, as well as very strong, I think, in security studies broadly. So I'm delighted to have with us Jay Healey as well, our senior research scholar at SIPA, who has really helped launch some very serious work here and training and engagement, as the director of a new report that we came out with this academic year, chaired by me and several others, but it was really Jay Healey's work around financial security and cyber risk that I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit today. So first and foremost, I just want to thank Bruce Schneier for being with us. Of course, he teaches a very famous and popular course and teaches at the Kennedy School, and is also long affiliation with IBM, started several enterprises that I think most recently one has been purchased by IBM. You'll tell us about that, and it's just great to have you here.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. So let me just start us off with a general sort of question about your worldview today. I mean, the internet was built as an open platform, increasingly, I think, getting fragmented in the world. I think the sense of cyber insecurity, the incidents that are now public, I think are obviously increasing. Is the open internet a kind of historical anomaly, or do you think we have a future for the open internet?
I think both are true. It's certainly an anomaly. I mean, the history of the internet is very much a history of accidental prominence and emergent properties. Right? The internet was designed by academics to talk about academic stuff, and then it was used to talk about Star Trek. And then a lot of people were talking about Star Trek, and then suddenly we were doing commerce on it, and banks started using it, and the internet kind of accreted. It wasn't designed, it emerged. And a lot of the decisions that were made when it was academics sharing data or academics talking about Star Trek, we're stuck with when it's a very different internet. And when I look at the history, I really look at those decisions and do they make sense for an internet that is connected to your car and your drivetrain that can be shut off remotely, or connected to a power plant or a dam, or an airline reservation system, all of these critical systems which sort of accidentally showed up. Now, and the question you're really asking is can we live with the open internet? I think the answer is yes, but I don't think we can live with the decisions we made in the 60s, 70s, even 80s when none of this stuff mattered. I mean, countries are grappling with that. Countries largely left the internet alone and let it be what it was because it didn't matter. Now, a few years ago, some countries like China wakes up and says, well, what do you mean our citizens are organizing on the internet? That was for unimportant stuff.
So you're saying both are true, but how, in your view, do we maintain the properties of openness if we value those and deal with the dangers that are, as well as the preferences, which are increasingly, I think, becoming more balkanized?
We might not be able to globally. The internet was very much American ideals exported to the world. And a country, even back off from China, a country like Singapore has very different views on openness. U.S. is very much an international outlier on our free speech laws. And can we maintain a single global internet with all of these different laws and even norms? I don't know the answer. We might not. There's a lot of push from some countries to, this is our national internet and we want our rules to apply here. The internet works best when one set of rules apply everywhere. So can we stop what we call balkanization of the internet? And I don't know the answer. I think it's from very dicey years right now, where a lot of countries are pushing for that. Or maybe the dicey years are behind us and we're over that hump.
In my own thing, I've been starting to get my head around a post-internet cyberspace, right? We came up with, internet used to be small I, and internet was just a network of networks. And then we made a capital I when we invented this one. And that's why for my students, and I always insist, and I always write capital I internet, because this is a precious thing. This is one thing that we had to invent. There's one internet that is going to connect all of us. And we kind of came up afterward with cyberspace, so not just the internet, but the collection of IT devices that are interconnected, mostly through that TCP/IP protocol. And so I think we need to start getting our heads around the post-internet cyberspace, where we still have this global network of connected devices, but it's not an internet anymore. You've now got these national borders, you've now got walled gardens for corporations, and we need to get past it being globally reachable in the way that it has been. And to one of Bruce's points, the U.S. has been back and forth on this, right? At the same time, it has both of saying it needs to be a single global space where we can all participate, that is coming from one part of government, and just while other parts of government are insisting on the opposite, especially on the law enforcement side. And so even our own government is really in this tension back and forth.
Well, I think there's obviously a huge conversation happening in the world that appreciates, the dynamism and innovation that is associated with the openness factor. But at the same time, China is a very large economy that has created a walled garden. And so they've been able to achieve a degree of scale and innovation within that environment. So I think you've been thinking about this for so long. I guess I want to push you a little bit further on, is it a question of scale that preserves, the dynamism, or how do you maintain that dynamism in a world where countries are increasingly creating, their own different forms of standards and boundaries over the privacy, security elements? And we can't assume those are going to be scaled back. In fact, I would think they were likely to increase and have their more national character. And it might not, if we look at what Europe is introducing in their GDPR, that's very much got its own character. These are non-uniform, but they all have consequences.
It's interesting to watch some of these different spheres. I mean, China has, in a sense, a unique advantage. They're a very, very large market. so they really can build their own stuff. They have a language barrier where things can be optimized for their language, and which is, not a wall, but it is a barrier for most of us. We will not go to a Chinese website because we can't read it. So they can do things that a smaller country can't do. And also, because of their national policies, they can have national firewalls. They can really make it hard for other countries to compete. And they have their own chat apps and their own social networks that are Chinese, and Chinese use them because it's easier, not because they're forced to. And that's something, let's say, another country that might want to engage in strong censorship, like Saudi Arabia, almost can't get away with, because it's just not a big enough market. Everyone's going to be on Facebook because that's what there is. You're not going to have a Saudi national Facebook equivalent. What I like seeing, and this either goes good or bad. So I look at Europe. Right? Europe is very much the regulatory superpower in the world right now. And the law you refer to is the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. It is a very strong privacy and security law, which is going into force, I believe, next month. It was passed last year, and we're going to see how it's enforced. And looking at Europe's recent track record, they're not afraid to impose penalties on companies that the companies will notice, really unlike the US. And there you have something where sort of the best of regulation will have a knock-on effect in our market, because Europe's a large market. Companies will tune their products and services to the strict regulation, and then we all benefit. And that'll be more true for a product, let's say an internet-enabled thermostat, less true for Facebook. I mean, Facebook can build differential privacy in different markets, and they're likely to. So that, and there I see regulation helping. And I look at something like China, which will impose restrictions on what Apple does and Google does, and those companies will go along because it's too big a market that they don't want to pull out, and that could harm us. So, I mean, I see a lot of moving parts here, and it's not clear how this is going to work. I mean, we will be better off the fewer different sets of regulations a company has to follow. But there's been a lot of examples in the US where states have different regulations, and the companies are managing okay. So my sympathy for them is kind of low. For the companies. That I think, just deal with it. This is the way law works, and this is a cost of you doing business. So breach notification laws in the United States. And there are some 30-something states have them. There's no federal law, and we all benefit. I mean, if we, and I don't know where New York falls, but if we are in a state without a breach notification law, because every company we deal with has customers in California, the notification's public, and when we learn about breaches. And when companies like Uber defy the law, they're going to be fined, and we will all benefit because that'll improve security. Right? So this can go well. I don't need a single global laws, but it could also go badly by balkanizing things, by bifurcating the net in various ways.
I do wish the EU had a competence on security and resilience of the internet, right? They've got a competence for privacy, so they push privacy. And so we get things that are pushing privacy as the top priority, and sometimes you have trade-offs, right? I mean, sometimes the things that you might do for privacy aren't right for example, resilience of the internet as a whole. And so you have these trade-offs which the EU isn't able to do because it doesn't have competence for the resilience of the internet. I am glad, and this gets to some of the Dean's work, is that we used to talk about cross-border data flows, which I like, but now I think some of the conversation is moving towards digital trade. And when we talk about cross-border data flows, it sounds like immigration, right? It sounds like you don't have control over your borders and things flow across them, and that's not the era that we're in right now. Whereas if we're talking about digital trade, similar handle to talk about roughly the same thing, I think it allows us to think about the positives a little bit more. I do have a question, right? Because I was doing I was doing a report a while back, and I got into a debate that I wasn't expecting of someone that was saying that, of course, if we're in a globe with strong internet borders, where countries have strong internet borders, that therefore, of course, computer security would improve because states could impose controls on their borders. And I'm curious your take on that.
It's interesting, because so I think there's a tech component of that. I'm not sure how we can have strong national internet borders.
Well, China is.
It's really, but it's
get a firewall.
Yeah, it's not that, but it's not that good. I mean, the Chinese firewall works through some technical means that make it a little bit more annoying, and an enforcement mechanism that where people watch each other, so people don't try to evade the mechanisms. And so it's not really a technical solution. It's much more of a police state-like solution.
True, yeah, keeping information, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if you go to China, you'll be able to get the whole internet. From your hotel, there's no problem. It's just not something that a normal citizen will do every day because, you know, it's safer not to.
Well, imagine we could get better. Imagine that.
So postulate.
General Alexander gets his way in the United States, and Fort Meade is now kind of a defender, and.
Right. So they're very porous borders. I mean, there's lots of ways to get directly to someone. I mean, someone sitting in this room that won't go through the national border, and I think that will always be true. If you're assuming you're against geopolitical threats, against threats from other countries, you will get some increased security, right, at the expense of forcing your border to do a surveillance-like inspection, and with the problems that causes. I think you'll be more vulnerable to other threats because of the architecture you're being forced to build. Right? And this is going to be a question of, you know, what threats are you concerned about? Are you worried about freedoms and privacy and liberty and you know, the free expression and the right to exchange of ideas? Or are we worried about, you know, I don't know, scams coming from other countries and draining our bank accounts?
Well, let me, I think you have written a lot on the threat environment, and to help us orient us on how you see the threat environment, could you just share a little bit more about, you know, what are you most worried about in terms of cybersecurity threat? What should we be most worried about? You know, are you worried about you know, North Korea taking out critical infrastructure or other adversaries of the United States? Are you more worried about doctoring of data? You know, are you more worried about the connection between, you know, cyber-physical systems going forward? I mean, there's such a large landscape. How would you prioritize these worries?
Luckily, you could worry about everything. I think those are all risks and things to think about, and things I have been writing about. I mean, the cyber-physical systems and international threats and crime. I worry more about the precursor trends. So I worry about the fact that large corporations control our data, our computers, our connections. I think that is something that's perfectly legal. This is not illegal activity. But that creates an environment where those other risks are more capable of flourishing. So I worry that companies like Facebook and Google have all of our data and, you know all of our secrets. You know, I mean, Google knows me better than my wife does, because right, you never lie to your search engine, ever. And I worry about that being extended to control. That all of these companies are not only trying to have our data and learn about us in ways to influence us at the request of somebody else against our best interest, right? That's advertising. And as we see, political advertising. That's moving into control. Right? So companies like Apple are trying to control our devices. So if you have an IoT device, whether it's a car or a thermostat or a pressure cooker or a toy, you're controlling it through your phone. Right? This is now a single point of control, and Google and Apple own these points. Companies like Philips and Siemens are trying to control home systems. The systems like Alexa are trying to control also your environment. And to me, this is going to be the next battleground. It was about data. Now it's going to be about capabilities. That these companies will have extraordinary control over how we interact with the Internet of the future. Because it's not going to be through screens like we're used to, it's going to be through embedded devices. And whoever controls that interface controls a lot. And those companies benefit from insecurity. Everybody wants you to be secure except from them. Right? Google will give you great security as long as you let them read everything. The US government, FBI, wants to have great security as long as they have a copy of the key in case they need it. And that's true up and down the line.
So one has the impression that actually the relationship between the individual and data is changing, right? That there's a bit of a movement, I think, to have more opt-in or opt-out, you know, that there isn't sort of automatic data collection in its kind of ubiquity in today's moment as compared with sometime in our past. Now, it doesn't mean that people are exercising those rights or that there are uniform ways of exercising, but I guess, and so the one thing is the relationship between the individual and the data that's being collected, and the other is the relationship between the individual and the devices themselves. And do you see a difference there? Do you see different protocols developing there?
Yeah. It's interesting to watch. I mean, I don't think there have been changes in the U.S. on data collection. I forget who wrote it, but I've heard it called the biggest lie on the internet. And that's that button that says, I agree. That you click without having read the thing you swear up and down that you read and agreed to before you click that.
Yeah.
And we do that all the time. And that governs, in as much as it does, what the device, what the website, what the service can collect. And they do collect everything. I mean, this is going to change in Europe. We're talking about GDPR. In the GDPR regulations, the opt-in is not allowed. Sorry, opt-out is not allowed. Collecting for one purpose and using it for another. So when, what is the fitness company that exposed all of our secret military bases? Strata. So when they say, you know, we will collect your data so you can better learn about your fitness trends, it would be illegal for them to anonymize it and publish it, because that was not the use that the user agreed to when they agreed. And that's going to change everything in Europe, because all of our notice and consent worked okay, not great, when it was a screen. When I walk by a camera, a drone, something in a retail store that's just looking at my phone ID and watching where I go, notice and consent fails, because there isn't a screen I'm interacting with where I can at least, you know, click the lie and say I agree. There's no option for that. So I'm not sure, as we move from screens to embedded devices, how we're going to get that kind of consent that Europe's demanding that I think makes a lot more sense, and whether certain practices just won't be allowed because there's no way to get the user's consent. There are debates now. If you have an Alexa in your home, or to say something even more obvious, you have a baby monitor, and you have a babysitter and leave. Are you legally, morally, ethically obligated to tell the babysitter that there's a device listening to what that person is doing? And I think the law is going to make decisions about those sorts of things.
So,
I agree.
Yeah, I was going to ask you. I mean, so but in the hierarchy of worries that one might have about growing interconnection and the threat vectors that exist, Jay, is yours equally around sort of the role of the large corporation, or do you worry more about sort of individual bad actors and states?
I'm split. You know, especially someone that's has government background and you know, and talks.
We have lots of things to worry about.
and wants to encourage students to go into government and to serve. I also see that if a lot of the, especially in the United States, for the last couple of years, I feel like if we want to make a difference for these changes, perhaps it has to be at the platform companies themselves where you can implement those changes. Mm-hmm. I'm working through that myself. I tend to be more worried about the vector of the overall direction. Every year since I first started getting into this, cyber conflict has been worse than it had been the previous year. One of my favorite quotes was, few if any contemporary security controls can stop a dedicated red team. Saying if a red team, like if you pay a hacker to try and break in, they're going to get through. And it's essentially saying that the attacker has the advantage over the defenders. And that quote was from 1979. So for 40 years, awesome. We've known that the attackers have the advantage and are going to get through. And so all of us that are in the business of computer security, right, at best, we've been spending all of our effort to break even. At best, the Red Queen effect, if you will. And so I worry that if just doing more of the same is not going to get us there. And so if conflict every year has been getting worse and the attackers had the advantage decade after decade, how long can the system stay in equilibrium before the attacker just doesn't have the advantage but has supremacy? Where it's every time you try and launch a new product, there's going to be well-minded security researchers, hackers, nation states that swarm over it and take it down. And a fundamentally different kind of internet that we have now. And the example I use, Bruce and I, we both talk about Gutenberg in the movable type. I say, imagine if 20 years after Gutenberg had invented or had developed the printing press in Europe, that the Pope, the petty princes of Europe, pretty much anyone that cared, could know exactly what was being printed, who was printing it, and to whom that information was being passed, right? You probably don't get the Enlightenment. You probably don't get the Renaissance. You've changed the vector of human history, not for 10 years or for 20 years or 200, but for as long as there are humans in the universe. Our potential is going to be less because we couldn't trust that underlying communications mechanism. And yet that is exactly the situation. Well, that is analogous. I mean, see, when I was a think tanker, I could say things like it is exactly. Now that I'm a senior research scholar, like I've got to be more precise, right? That certainly has echoes to the situation that we're in today, where exactly what we're printing, who's printing it, and to whom we're passing it can be known by anybody that particularly cares to look.
And sort of bring that back to what you said earlier, and what I started with. What's changing is that the internet is sort of accidentally permeating everything. So when I think about the technical threats, I worry about autonomy, I worry about automation, and I worry about physical agency. That our computers are now not just about data, they're doing things. Right? So this phone can raise the temperature in my house in Minneapolis. It could lower the temperature. If you hacked into this phone, you could lower the temperature and burst my pipes before I got home on Saturday. Right? You can destroy property. We've had people hacking into cars at speed, disabling the drivetrain. And so these things, so it's automation, right? Think of the flash crash, how fast things happen. It is autonomy, right? Things happening without a human saying, wait, don't do that. And then physical agency, touching the real world, implantable medical devices, automobiles, power plants. That's the environment change that's happening now.
And you haven't mentioned AI. It's sort of everyone's talking AI now. It seems that problems end up bringing in AI on every corner. But I mean, let's just say deep machine learning will create a degree of autonomy and autonomous decision making around certain kinds of things. How worried are you about that direction?
I'm less worried about AI as an end state because I think it's the precursor technologies where the risks lie, and we're going to hit those a lot earlier. I think a lot of the AI doomsaying is a projection of our current fears, like all science fiction is. Right? We project our current way of thinking onto the future, and right now we end up with dystopian AI. And I don't think that's necessarily a real projection. But all of the things people worry about AI are going to happen well before AI. You don't need RoboCop before you have to worry about someone putting a gun on a drone and having it, latch onto somebody's MAC address on their phone and start assassinating people. I don't need AI for that.
So, these things are happening, and, obviously they're producing a lot of efficiencies and innovation and economic growth and new opportunities, as well as dislocations in the dark side. And we could talk about both, but we can't stop these trends in some respects. And so what is your remediation strategy for the world we're in?
So this is hard, because I think in some ways we have to try to slow some of these trends. And that in our society, when a technology is able to kill you, it is regulated. Right? It's pharmaceuticals, it's automobiles, it's airplanes, it's construction. And we just don't allow unfettered innovation in pharmaceuticals. I mean, we don't. We say, look, there's going to be some very expensive testing before you can put that in someone else's body. That's the way it goes. I'm sorry it affects your profits. And we do that because the effects of getting it wrong are people dying. And when the internet becomes one of those technologies, I think we're going to start having serious conversations about regulating it. Now, you point out, I think rightly, the international nature makes this much harder than pharmaceuticals. Right? And then how do we deal with the fact that these services will be available on the internet from other countries? Not everyone's going to follow the rules. But I think that is where we're headed. And one of the reasons I talk a lot about government intervention and regulation now is my fear is that there'll be a disaster, like someone will crash all the cars, and not just a car. I mean, these are computers failing, right? And computers fail differently. Cars fail where we know how cars fail. Cars break once in a while. We have some mean rate of failures. Computers break in a different way. They all work perfectly until one day when none of them do. And when that type of failure mechanism hits cars, you can have some very scared legislators calling for regulation and, can you have a law written in 2 hours? So having conversations now about this potential future allows us to actually think about your question, which is hard. How do we do this well?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and as Bruce was talking, it reminded me of a tweet that I saw a little bit ago, and saying if you want to try and regulate encryption, just imagine how difficult the drug war is, except cocaine is made of math. and I thought it was just a great way of putting it. Right, we're talking about math, we're talking about ideas, we're talking about bits and bytes that are moving around, and I thought it was a interesting way. Yeah.
But, Jay, let me remind you of your rather more optimistic essay of late in which you were...
did I? I'm sorry.
I think, you were framing a conversation, I thought a really productive conversation about creating a defensible internet. Where, in fact, there were interventions of a policy nature and a technology nature that could achieve improvements at scale, and we should identify those because there's a lot of bad hygiene that is producing vulnerabilities that could be remediated. So, I mean, that takes us somewhere we should go, doesn't it?
Yeah, and we said specifically in that report that this need not require a Cyber Manhattan Project or a Cyber Moonshot or any of the others. I mean, that might be nice, but the quiet application of the right kinds of solutions, the patient applications of the solutions which give the defender the most advantage at the greatest scale and the least cost, can give us a whole lot of areas. And we looked at the solutions in there. We've got a few copies hanging around that say within technology, operations, and policy, within the enterprise, and across cyberspace as a whole.
Solved in 2 pages.
Right. Right. So we say, for example, like end-to-end encryption, Windows Update. These were solutions that helped everybody all at once. that aren't cheap to do. They're not easy to do. But once they're in place, everybody gets the benefit out of it. If we do security the way we have been, someone invents a new widget. We then have to deploy that widget. Even if that's a perfect widget, we have to deploy it 1 billion times because we focus on the endpoints, and we've got to do that perfectly. And that's hard. And so we're looking at these ways of how we can get the greatest scale the most defense advantage at the greatest scale and the least cost. And to where the original question was and where Bruce was coming in, it really hit me as we were looking at some of the solutions. We had a lot of solutions that were easy. We were saying like more transparency, by which we meant, Consumer Reports is going to start coming out with cybersecurity ratings for devices. That's not going to be easy for them, but it's going to be a heck of a lot better and less pain for society than if Congress were trying to legislate that. This is a lot easier to align the market incentives to get the right thing happening than if we try and do it. Some of the other solutions, which undoubtedly gave us that leverage we were looking for, were liability for software manufacturers, for example, or holding ISPs responsible so they can't pass the trash, right? So that they stop the tragedy of the commons so that they've got to detect cybersecurity problems and attacks rather than let them pass. Those hit innovation. And what really caught me, Dean, was I went back and I reread one of the original books in the space, Future Shock about Alvin Toffler.
Yeah.
He was writing in 1970 about how the future shock we're going to feel of all of this technology, especially but not only information technology, is going to give us this feeling of psychological sickness because we're not going to be able to chase after it. Some people will, especially in cities. But many people are going to feel like they are forever chasing and being left behind and feeling strangers in their own country, in their own society. And it really made me, reading this from 1970, say, maybe we need a large macro break on innovation so that we can catch up and deal with this. And I'm not comfortable with that finding. I'm not comfortable with that. But reading this from 1970 and saying, boy, did they get this right.
Well, I don't know if that would make you feel better that productivity is declining, so you may get that unwittingly. But I just don't want to let Bruce go with, you need to give us a path forward if you're thinking so deeply about these risks.
Totally fair. And I'm writing a book on this, and it is due at the end of March. So I will have better answers in 2 months. This is, and a lot of it is these sorts of pieces that Jason was talking about, that liabilities and regulations. I think it's very important, and you sort of see it in some of the things we're talking about, that we need to align tech and policy, that the best tech won't do any good if people won't use it, and people will use it if the policy surrounding that makes it obvious for them to do it. And that's going to be regulations and liabilities and the rules that set the playing field. And I think this is what I think of as the most important lesson of Edward Snowden. Right? We always knew that technology can subvert policy. He showed us that policy can subvert technology, and that if you don't have both working, you get the benefit of neither. And I believe we are going to see stronger liabilities for software engineers. So right now it's kind of a big deal. There's at least one Volkswagen programmer who's in jail for, I think it was 2? Executive, so 2 people in jail for writing software that for 10 years deliberately evaded emissions control testing. I mean, that's a big deal. And my hope is that will ripple through the industry and people will, make decisions about what they're doing. So I think, I think Uber is going to get some really serious penalties for their behavior with their most recent vulnerability. They evaded vulnerability disclosure rules by pretending it was a bug that was told them, and they paid off the people who stole their data. I mean, really bad. Then recently, they admitted they did the real wrong thing. I think it was a congressional hearing a couple of days ago. So I think we are going to see more of these penalties. I think that is very much a way forward. that liabilities are coming into our industry. More professionalism is. I think there's going to be some level of engineer that's going to be licensed in the near future.
Would you slow down for example, the autonomous vehicle or semi-autonomous vehicle? There's so much data that shows that the safety consequences are very great,
Right.
which is why this has moved much faster than I would have anticipated, because the agencies are looking at that data and putting some weight on it.
Right.
So,
And I mean, surprised me, but I think it's moved faster just because the tech has gotten better than we thought. Turns out throwing a lot of computers at something really does make a bigger difference than we thought 20 years ago. And that's all of machine learning. It's not new theory. It's just a lot more computers and a lot more data. And things have worked that you didn't before. Driverless cars are almost a special case because humans are such terrible drivers. I mean, we kill 40,000 people a year. And we are just terrible drivers. So you don't have to be a very good computer to be better than a person. Right? You just don't. The bar is so low, plus computers never drink. Right? So score. But here again, the precursor technologies, I think, are just the car. When I tried to buy a car last year, I couldn't buy a car with the features I wanted that didn't have an internet connection. I was unable to purchase it. Right? I could turn off, getting the updates to the GPS, but it has an internet connection, and I'm pretty sure I can't go in there and unclip a wire and turn it off. Or if I did, I'd void my insurance. So that's where the risk is. Adding the driverless car, I don't think makes the risk that much greater. And so my risks are today. This is why, again, back to I'm not worried about AI. The precursor technologies are where the risks are, because that is now an automated system that affects the real world that can be hacked over the internet, even though it is not driverless. I must drive it.
And the interim steps forward are increasing transparency and liability,
which is good,
for those elements around which more expertise would make a difference. But there are a lot of elements around which expertise will not make a difference. And so I think there's not a CEO in America that feels that they can create a truly defensible corporation against a sophisticated state actor, devoted to penetration. So would you put liability, how would you deal with liability in those circumstances?
So I think this is probably a better place to talk about this. I usually talk to techies that have a to a techie, a standard is a document that you must meet to the letter or you fail the standard. So your normal engineer, when they think about regulation and standards, that's what they think of. They think of the standard for, wireless. And if you don't meet the standard, you're just not a wireless device and you can't communicate and it doesn't work. It's all or nothing. And we know that regulation and liabilities and standards are much more flexible. They're open to interpretation. They have things like take due care. And they change over time. A bunch of years ago, people remember, Netflix had the Netflix Prize. They sent out a bunch of anonymous data and said, anybody who can give us recommender systems that will improve people's movie recommendations, we'll give a lot of money to. Some people said, oh, let's do something else. And they took the data and de-anonymized it, annoying Netflix. And it was a big incident. They were not penalized. But when they ran the test again, the contest the next year without any changes, the Federal Trade Commission said, what the hell are you doing? And because the world changed. The first time was a surprise, and you're allowed to be surprised because we didn't know how bad it was. Second time, you knew. So, I see some the same flexible regulation regimes that we see in other industries applying in the computer industry. And yeah, it is going to slow things down. That's going to be the effect, but we get to decide, do we want speed or security, because we kind of can't have both.
And on the, on the issue of the liability for software makers, I generally come down on that side, at least things like nutrition labels and the rest, so that people know what they're getting and what software is going to be in this product they buy. But a lot of that continues concentration, right? It's difficult to have a small company, a startup that's rolling out a software product, if you're going to be held liable for it, right? So it means that you're maybe going to get buyout by one of the larger companies that can give you the legal cover and change the innovation dynamics that we have and put more concentration in the platform companies if it's not done well. That might lead us more secure overall, but it does lead to these really important effects. On the liability for companies themselves, one of the big issues that comes out, and it happens, it happens all over Twitter whenever this happens, is this company got hit. Let's not tear them apart because then we're blaming the victim, right? Mm-hmm. This is really hard to get right. No one can have a perfect defense. This company got hit, and we should blame the victim. And there's a lot to that. There really is. Some of the companies that might have hit by WannaCry or NotPetya, right? They hadn't had a chance to patch it. They were going to, and they just got hit before they did. But what we haven't done, and this is one of the things that I picked up from a lot of Bruce's writings over the years that taught me a lot on this, we're going to find the solutions in this space that we do in other places in society. We don't know yet when a company gets hit very well on whether or not we're blaming the victim or if they went down to the beach and the beach said, don't swim, riptide, sharks, jellyfish, swim it, don't swim here, you're going to die. And they say, hey, what great water, splash. And a lot of the companies that get hit did that. They were like Equifax.
Let's talk
right?
about Equifax.
Right? They avoided all of those signs. It's not blaming the victim. They had all of these things posted. Do not do this kind of stuff. And they went in anyhow. And in our debate, we're not really good about separating which of those two categories that a particular company or individual happens to be.
Right, because if you think about a company like Equifax, which if you have best practices, even minimal, they didn't follow it. So you can say, you're
even
not doing
standard practice, not even best.
You're not doing the things that a reasonable company is expected to do if they have all this data on individuals. Yes, we understand if you are Sony and the North Korean government decides they don't like you and they're going to break in. We're not going to hold you responsible for that. The attackers, it's above your pay grade. They're going to get in. But, if you make it stupid easy, then it's your fault. We can have these nuanced conversations.
How about OPM? Where would you put that in that spectrum?
OPM was kind of stupid easy, sadly. Yeah. But that's both. That's an advanced actor and stupid easy. Yeah. So,
yeah.
So you got to look at the details.
Yeah. So, we're going to open this up for questions. But before we do that, let me just ask you both a final kind of invitation. We're trying to create the next generation of public policy leaders here. And both of you are teaching about technology and security to public policy-oriented students. So how do you see the mix of skills that you think the next generation who will engage these issues need to have?
Opportunity is knocking on the door if you're interested in cybersecurity.
So actually, this is the best question of the night. This is, I think, is probably the most important thing I'm going to say. That in cybersecurity, as in many areas, the policy debates are deeply technical. And we need people who can straddle these. We need, I call public interest technologists. Right? I teach at Harvard, and there's a law school up the street, and every year, 1/5 of the graduates of that law school do not go work for a corporation, don't go work in private practice, work for a public interest law. And the law school is having soul-searching conferences because that number is so low. You go to computer science, and the number of people who don't go to a private company to make a lot of money is close to zero. We need to fix that. And it's not just, I'm not just blaming the students. There aren't the jobs to catch them. There are, if you're an attorney and you spent You spend 2 years with the ACLU, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and you go into private practice, those 2 years are valued. If you go work at Google, you take a year off to work in technology in the White House, you know, it's you wasted a year. You know, why didn't you go kayaking? I mean, we just don't have that ecosystem, and we need it. And you'll see it in the debates. You'll see it in the debates about backdoors in the FBI. You'll see it in the debates of the vulnerabilities and disclosure. All of these debates are you must know the tech to formulate the right policy. And it's not just cybersecurity. I mean, this is going to be true in climate change, in food safety, in the future of employment, in all of these issues. And the more programs there are that marry tech and policy, I mean, the better we're going to be able to navigate the next century. And to the extent we fail, I mean, that's where we're going to fail. Mm-hmm. It's going to be technologists who are ignorant about policy and policymakers who are ignorant about technology. So I love these joint programs.
Yeah, fantastic. I completely agree. Anything you'd like to add to that?
Just 2 or 3 things. Well, I agree. 2, also the
that's one thing.
Got, for the people in the room, obviously not for the folks on the webcast, we have our billboard out here, which is the SIPA when we're out for the social, the cybersecurity jobs for SIPA graduates, and take a look at that, because that has these different ways that someone that's in a international affairs public policy school can find their way in. Cyber threat intelligence is one of the top ones, right? International affairs public policy students can write, think, they understand the world, they understand the geopolitical situation. So if we can get enough understanding of technology, it's a great place. There are a ton of jobs in it, and then once you're in there, you can move laterally into other places. Jobs in just cyber policy, there aren't enough of those places, as Bruce mentioned, right? State Department has maybe 30 Foreign Service officers and others that are in the space. DHS has maybe 15.
FTC has very few.
Commerce has some, and there are great jobs, but there aren't as many to catch those people that are interested. And just to close, one of the favorite class that I've taught here, all of my classes and all my students are my favorites, but one that was really good was we taught last semester in cybersecurity, tech, policy, and law. And so our colleague Steve Belvin is here from the computer
That's
science
exactly the name of
school.
my class.
And it took us 3 professors to do what you do, right? So we had Steve Belvin, you know, one of the classic folks in computer science, right? Helped invent firewalls, right? One of those, and Matt Waxman from the law school, one of the top national security lawyers, and me. And we had 9 students, 9 comp sci students, 9 law students, and 9 international affairs.
It's way more fun than my class.
And we put them together into teams to look at these different areas, like looking at blockchain, looking at civic technology, looking at the replacement for social security numbers. So you had tech students, comp sci students, law students, and public policy students all looking at these areas. And we've got some of those students. We've got some of those students here, and we'll talk to them during the social.
Fantastic. That was a great course. I think we're building other courses that try to do this. It requires injecting a bit more flexibility in some of these other programs.
Are you looking at joint degrees? I would love to see like a joint JD and computer science masters or public policy computer science.
Well, we have lots of people who do that, but we haven't yet created a revised curriculum.
Right. I mean, like 3 years and you get both degrees kind of thing.
Yeah, so that's a challenge for the future. I think that's happening more naturally around data science and some things like data science and business. And I think there will be more of these coming. Absolutely. I'd love to have us build such a degree. But let's open it up and hear what's on your minds. Who'd like to start us off? It's such a quiet group here. Yes.
There will be.
Sir, right there. Yeah.
Niall Ferguson, the historian, has said that, in his opinion, there's no way to ever protect against a non-state actor hacking, that the internet will always be vulnerable. I mean, he's a pretty smart dude.
There's actually, I mean, On the one hand, you can say that's true, but there's actually a lot of nuance. Because the attacker does have the advantage for a whole lot of reasons I could spend an hour explaining. And that's been true since the 70s, we learned. But that doesn't mean all attackers succeed all the time. Yeah. It really is a function of the skill, the risk aversion, the tenacity of the attacker versus the defender. So yeah, I mean, if the government of China wanted into your computer, they're in your computer. And if they're not, one of two things is true. Either they don't want to be in your computer, or you're not high enough on the priorities list, right? They got enough people to do 10,000, and you're 10,020. Yeah. So there's security there. A lot of the attacks we see, even though from sophisticated adversaries, are very unsophisticated attacks. The attack against the DNC was not a sophisticated attack. Now, if those unsophisticated attacks failed, would they have tried the sophisticated attacks? Maybe. Maybe they would have decided these attacks we need to save for a more important target, for a different reason. So there's a lot of calculus in that. But yes, you're moving aside everything else. It's the attacker against the defender. The attacker wins. But everything else plays into that in the real world.
And I'd like to add one point on getting out of that situation, which is extremely difficult, and then add another point of subtlety to this. One, it's in part true because it's so complex, right? Even as someone that's been in this business as long as I have difficulty trying to secure myself as well as I can, right? It is just tough. And so the kinds of solutions that we push are those, as Bruce had said in another context, that take the user out of the solution. It has just gotten so tough to try and do this. We've got so many devices. We've got so much around us. It's going to be genuinely true. But we shouldn't make too much of it. It's really easy to use cyber capabilities to take a target down from the other side of the planet. Trivially easy for many targets. It's really, really difficult to keep a target down in the face of determined defenses over time. Now, my background was from the Air Force, right? This was a classic Air Force problem from the 1930s of saying the strategic bomber is going to get through with a flick of our industrial web fingers. We will take down the other side's factories and infrastructure, and therefore we can win the war. People are going to panic, and we'll win the war in 215 days if Congress will give us this many B-17s. Right? This is the way that the Army Air Corps thought, and all major air forces thought. And it turns out that it's not true. That it's easy to take a runway down, a factory down, but then they're going to rebuild it. So far, this has been true. Right. It might be easy to take a target down. And this is where we worry about industrial control systems, cyber-physical systems. It's easy to take it down, but then you reload the hard drive, you bring your backups, which is easy when it's just a computer. But when that's a dam, when that's an electrical grid, when that's a car, then you're actually physically breaking something, not made of ones and zeros, but made of steel and concrete. So I think we're in the cusp of this very changed situation.
Although so far, that's been right. I mean, if you look at the U.S. and Israel attacking the Iranian nuclear power plant, Stuxnet,
yep.
We really didn't set back the nuclear program. It didn't really change the negotiations. In the end, the U.S. attacks against North Korean nuclear program didn't seem to do much. Russia attacking the Ukraine in 2016 and 2017. In both cases, those power plants were quickly back online. That you can do quick things, but it doesn't seem to affect the greater political situation. Can that change? I think it can for the reasons Jason is talking about, but it really hasn't yet. And that is, I think, surprising. And it's interesting, and I think it's that same notion from history that you can just, you rebuild your infrastructure, and it's very hard to sustain an attack. Right? We can take down, Dyn botnet can take down a whole bunch of websites, but they were up in 6 hours.
Down the Minuteman silos. Do you have an opinion about that?
I do not. I don't even know they were taken down.
Yeah. And this point on the Air Force, especially one of our colleagues, Greg Rattray, who did the first PhD in international affairs on cyber warfare, and now is at J.P. Morgan. And that came out in 1999. I'm sorry.
And now,
the book
and
was
now he's at
2001.
J.P. Morgan. We should think. We should all think about that.
Right. So when you hear that cybersecurity job's coming, right? So, great.
Okay, next question. I think, was this fellow in front of you, Hugo? Oh, you. All right, you have the mic.
Okay.
Hugo's in charge.
Hugo's in charge.
As far as I understood, there's these different levels of risk. One is the, like power plants or like very large infrastructure, infrastructures that could get hit. And then there's the risk for individuals, let's say bank accounts or social security numbers or cars that are more felt on a more individual level. To what extent do you think that from the past, looking at drugs, looking at cars and like seat belts or risk of perceiving flight and aircraft and how that has changed over time, just history, where people, once they perceive the risk and are informed about it with transparency, that they will push through like really purchasing more secure products or just making choices that will have just a strong enough impact as well as policy making.
So I'm not optimistic about that. I think there's a lot of psychological biases against doing that. We generally prefer the near-term advantage. Oh, look, a cool new iPhone, and the abstract theory that this might have some insecurity somewhere in there, and maybe I should think twice. That's not something that is going to be salient during the purchase moment. The question is would a disaster change people's opinion? Well, I mean, so far it hasn't. And I thought OPM might have, because pretty much every government official had their personal data stolen by the Chinese, and you'd think they would care about that, but nothing. Equifax, there were some very strong words. I testified before a House committee, and both sides were really pissed off. Yet absolutely nothing has happened, and nothing will. So I don't know. I don't think that people's perceptions of risk will rise to match the actual risks, because the risks are abstract, complicated, technical. And when you look at history, we did not get safety or security in any product without government intervention. Not cars, not buildings, not working conditions, not food, not flammable pajamas. I mean, nothing. That it does take government to step in and say, these are going to be the rules. You cannot make a product that kills people. You're just not allowed. I know it's cheaper. I know they'll buy it. You can't do it. Well, I don't see any other. I wish there was another way. But I see this as a quintessential market failure.
I love those points. That's really great. Another one of our colleagues, Dan Gear, says the enemy of security is not insecurity. The enemy of security is convenience.
Right.
And that has been core to this. So unless we can make the privacy decision or the security enforcing decisions easy to make by taking the user out of it, like end-to-end encryption, all right, good. I mean, when it's easy, when people say, oh, good, I get Apple isn't just easier to use, it's going to give me more security, people can choose Apple devices because of that. When I have people bang on the table and say, well, we needed a cyber moonshot or cyber Manhattan Project, I say we need a cyber silent spring, a cyber unsafe at
any speed,
any speed, right? Of this book or this thing that just changes the moment in the way we think about that. Some of my colleagues say, "Oh, digital Pearl Harbor." I was like, "Whoa, let's bring it. Let's bring it down a little bit here. Let's get Silent Spring first, right?"
I think we're all getting smarter. I think we're getting smarter. How about you? Do you have a question, comment?
He's definitely getting smarter.
Thank you. Such an interesting discussion. Thank you very much for organizing it. Just two requests, if I may. Bruce, if you could talk a little bit more on the precursors that you're worried about. You talked about the concentration of data. Mm-hmm. But please tell us a bit more about other precursors that weigh on you. And perhaps, Jason, could you talk a little bit about deterrence theory? I mean, if this situation...
Yeah, you actually picked a good person for that question.
Yeah. If the situation we have now so obviously favors the offense, what parallels are there to early nuclear theory, nuclear warfighting? Yeah. There's got to be some thinking there. Yeah. Thank you.
Great. Thanks. So great questions.
The precursor technologies are the ones I mentioned earlier. It is autonomy, automation, and physical agency. That as computers move into areas that are traditionally human, that we have the potential of moving the ways computers fail into these formerly ways humans fail. And the cars is a great example. Instead of just cars crashing randomly, you get no cars crashing or all the cars crashing. Right? You have that all or nothing. And I see a lot of worries because we've built all of our security systems around the human type of failure and not around the computer type of failure. And an easy one would be autonomous weapon systems, right? So you can certainly imagine we're going to move towards those, but what happens when you put a human out of the loop? What happens when can someone hack your system and suddenly the weapon's on fighting for the other side? Right? It was something that would never happen at scale. I mean, yes, you could have individual soldiers, you could turn them, but you can never turn the entire system. So those are the technologies. And machine learning flows into this, but it really is the automation. Look at the flash crash of 2010, I forget the year. Right? And so these are the. So this was two.
But what about the flash crash?
So these are two different programs that interacted in such a way that caused a stock market crash, because they were interacting so fast. By the time anybody realized what was going on, and a human said, someone pushed a stop button somewhere, it was too late. So the benefit of automation is speed. I mean, we can do things faster, which is great when they work, and disastrous when they don't work. The slower human maybe is not as good when it's working, but it's not as bad when it's failing. So those are the precursor technologies I'm worried about. All right, now deterrence, which I'm going to be interested in listening to.
Yeah, there's been
he's been taking notes on this, so he's ready.
There's been a ton that's been written on this. DoD is extremely vexed about deterrence right now. As a matter of fact, they're having a 2-day classified conference next week. I mean, this is really on everybody's minds right now. But a lot of times they're not necessarily interested in the stuff that the academics do, because we're great on these grand theories of deterrence, which I'll talk about in a second. They're interested in very specific pathways of deterrence, of deterring very specific actions or coercing or compelling people to stop doing that they're currently doing. So to them, it's a very specific problem of this. So it came out 2 weeks ago maybe that the new nuclear posture review was going to say that we might use nuclear weapons in response to getting hacked. A lot of Twitter blew up about that, a lot of eye rolling that happened. But if the United States was worried about Russian malware that were in electrical grid and even within nuclear power plants and could maybe cause an emergency scram or actually a meltdown, then you could imagine the Department of Defense saying, what specifically can we do that would get the Russians to decide not to execute that malicious software? So that, I think, I don't know, was that in their mind in that specifically when they were doing, but to me, that's the kind of path that they're currently looking at. Overall, on deterrence, there's been a lot of writing that's been done, that's been great. Martin Libicki, formerly RAND, formerly Columbia University, now at the Naval Academy, Janow from the Kennedy Center, have done wonderful work. Libicki he wrote the book on cyber war and cyber deterrence, and especially on how it's different from from nuclear deterrence. Janow, here are the different pathways that it can happen. For example, talking about entanglement. Right, we're all dependent on the same internet. Right, if we start doing things to it,
they're not going to crash our banking system if their money is also in our banking system. That kind of thing.
I tend to find it as it leads to wrong answers way more than it leads you to right answers.
Interesting.
Because I'm worried about the offense dominant, I aim my policy of solutions at stability, of saying what can we do to make sure this doesn't spin out of control. As far as I can tell in my research, no one has died from a cyber attack yet. But every year we're getting worse and worse and worse when we get to that line. So I say, what can we do to throw as much rebar and concrete into that threshold so that if a nation decides to cross that line and cause casualties, North Korea came really close with WannaCry hitting the UK National Health Service, that we're only crossing that when we decide to cross it and that we're not going to get there by miscalculation or mistake. I think cyber conflict is the most escalatory kind of conflict we've ever come across. since humans first picked up stick and stone against one another. And I'm especially aware that if you aim for deterrence, I was on the Defense Science Board Task Force on cyber deterrence, the natural answer in Washington, D.C., if you go to a warrior and you say, we need to deter, they're going to say, we need more fearsome offensive cyber forces. It is the natural ABC to them. Now, the paper that I'm working on right now is on surprise attack. Imagine that you knew that you were going to have to fight a really tough boxer who had an amazing right hook. You know you're probably not going to survive the first round, much less round 13, but they've got a glass nose. Then you want to get in a surprise attack. You want to bop that boxer in the nose before you ever get into the ring. And right now, American cyber defenses are so terrible that I'm concerned the more that we go out and talk about how awesome Cyber Command is and emphasize our offensive cyber forces, that we're inviting a surprise attack, not discouraging one.
Okay, let's collect a couple of questions if we may.
What do you think of Microsoft's call for a Geneva Convention on
Aspirational.
Hate the name. It's not in any sense a digital Geneva Convention, but it gives them a nice handle to put to it. Some of the individual ideas, I think are okay, right? I mean, they're saying, for example, let's talk further about norms about what states should and should not do and what the responsibility for companies are. Well, that's a harmless idea. When it comes to, they also want a few other things in there, like an independent attribution organization. I've kind of given up on countries able to do it. So when countries screw it up, I don't mind trying to turn to the private sector.
Turn to the private sector for attribution?
And there's been a lot of examples of that. I mean, companies have done some excellent attribution work. I mean, attribution, we know, takes time. It's not easy. It's possible. You better job doing it if you can spy on the entire internet.
So do you both think that it's escalatory or de-escalatory to say that we will be encouraging companies to engage in more active defense?
Super escalatory.
Okay.
I generally, I pretty much agree. I mean, and I don't mean this snidely, if you think an armed society is a polite society, you're probably going to like, the more you're going to like active defense, right? If you want to increase the cost on these folks that are doing things, it's hard for government to do it, so private sector should be allowed to do it. I tend to come down on the escalatory. There may be some edge cases where it makes sense, but I think those are very risky.
Okay.
Let's collect a couple of questions then.
Yeah.
I wonder if you all think that there is a risk that absolute security would take, or if that's a risk worth taking. And what I mean by that is the sense that, for example, if there weren't backdoors where the government could get in or different things like that, sometimes these situations have come up where there's someone who's committed a crime or they've done something. And I'll have discussions with people sometimes who would say, well, it's good, that there are these backdoors and things like that, because otherwise how do you get into this person's iPhone? Maybe a terrorist will go free. And at the same time, others who say, well, that's a risk I'm willing to take to live in a really secure, society where there wouldn't be, these backdoors or things like that. And I guess I was just curious to maybe, hear your thoughts on that sort of scenario.
I know you're aching to answer that question, but we're going to have another one.
So this is a question for the two of you in different respects. You talked about the lie that is the agreement to the button, and we talked about how the world would have changed if we had a history of what everybody was reading. I'd love to hear your comments on the fact that we don't have any consent or any kind of agreement from the kids that are growing up in this environment.
Let's take those two, and then we'll let Hugo go to the other side of the room and collect.
So I'll talk a bit about the back doors. Like all technologies, computers have good and bad uses. And the risk of having our systems insecure are much greater than the risk of bad guys using the secure systems. There's lots of ways to go after bad guys. I mean, yes, there is the occasional movie plot where the evidence is on the phone and nowhere else, and the room is locked, and no one's been in for 2 years, and we must break the phone to solve the crime. Those are very rare. More often, the phone is being used by a innocent person, and maybe even an important person. He's working in a government. He's working in a nuclear power plant, and the bad guys want to get into the phone. And so securing our devices is much more important, even though it makes law enforcement's job harder. And it's not really a risk we're willing to take. It is we are more secure because we're taking that risk. And so I think it's a very strong answer to that. And to me, that's obvious. Your question about kids, I think it's not just kids. The creep against our privacy, again, for our data, it always hits marginal populations first. It's kids, it's prisoners, it's soldiers, it's mentally disabled, right? It's not a coincidence that the first drug approved for use with a tracker that a computer in the pill that tracks that you've taken it was an antipsychotic drug. That is not a coincidence, right? Because that is a drug where we as society are willing to sacrifice that person's rights because we're scared that he won't take his pill. And so I worry about the acclimatization from all of those, not just generational. Generational, I think, is a big issue, but it's all those marginal populations that I worry about.
Yeah, and I think on absolute security, you won't find many of us that talk about absolute security. We don't have absolute security in any area, right? It's where we get those trade-offs. If I had any big disappointment with the previous administration, it's that they were never clear. President Obama would talk about how it's a balance. And we have to balance these things. We have to balance these things. Well, balance means nothing, right? I mean, everything's a balance, right? But where do you put your preference? And so the way that Bruce and I talk, is we say, well, defense first, right? Security first, right? And then, or put it prosperity first, right? Obama could have said, American prosperity is going to come first. Prosperity is going to come from having an open, secure internet, and the other aspects like law enforcement intelligence are important, but they're on a not to interfere basis. We could have done that differently, and I think it would have been
better.
Better, yeah.
Okay, let's get just the last 2 questions, if we have 2, and then let our...
More than 2, but
Okay.
We'll be hanging around afterwards.
Yeah, so I was curious. I think we find a lot of times that sort of the foundation we build security principles upon is not sound. So for instance, you mentioned end-to-end security, and I think something you'll find there, like RSA encryption algorithm, maybe was not perfect, right? And the NSA has a pretty significant say in new encryption algorithms. Or you look at, like containerized services, like all these isolation things, and you think, oh, these things are safe, but then you can have another process accessing that memory by exploiting out-of-order execution, and that's, a meltdown specter. So I guess what do you guys think about how to define these foundations of security in a way that lets us build a truly secure sort of model?
Small question.
Hello, thanks for the really interesting discussion. I have 2 quick questions. The first relates to the concentration of data and the concentration of power that comes with it. So that's more a question to Bruce, I guess, whether you're concerned about that in terms of security implications it might have, and what do you think about the idea to have some form of regulatory intervention that would require big platform companies to share data with each other, or with smaller companies to allow them to train the algorithms in a way to have a more of an experimentalist open environment. And to Jason, it's a question partly caused by your comment about the distinction you seem to make between data flows and digital trade, because while the whole debate about international law in cyberspace seemed so stale for a long time, with the Trans-Pacific Partnership that is now being revived, you have a trade agreement that is was written by the US with a provision on free data flows, now abandoned by the US and revived by the 11 remaining members, that entrenches this idea that you need to justify restrictions on data flows between countries. So the question is, isn't there a way in which international economic law can serve as a safeguard of those free data flows instead of an impediment to them?
So I guess I'll start. Yes, I am worried about data concentration. I think that's, I mean, certainly concentration of power and monopoly power. I think that's, it's very dangerous. I mean, we saw that with, in the last election. Even something as simple as I think we were safer when there were 10,000 ISPs than when we have 6. That the distribution just makes it harder for any sustained operation. I mean, yes, you're noisier, right, in the security of each one of those. But, you know, our email is in like one of 5 companies right now. 4, I mean, I don't know what the number is, but it used to be one of 10,000. And I think that had much more resilience. And I think that's also the answer to the question in the back, that we are never going to, well, never is a bad word, not in the foreseeable future are we going to build secure foundations. We don't know how. We don't have the engineering ability. So how do we build a resilience system that can handle failures at different levels, even down to, you know, something happening on the chip without destroying all security or a flaw in the encryption algorithm? We're no longer in the 90s where the NSA affects standards in the way they did. So I think that kind of influence is over. I think semi-permanently, unless the UK ramps up. But I mean, thinking in terms of resilience is going to be the way to get around the fact that we cannot build a secure base to build. We just don't know how. We can do better, but there's going to be surprises.
And one of the things you've written about for decades is, right, I mean, in no area do we have true security, right? Everything is just a matter of good enough. Everything. And, you know, the classic example is the safe, right? I mean, when I was in intelligence, right, I mean, the safe would say this is secure for this long, for this many, you know, this person using this kind of drill, or in fire, right? I mean, you're certified for this kind of fire for this long. And so it's been tough because in security we've said, all right, we'll try and build it so that it is secure enough to keep out the script kiddies, but it's not going to keep out China. And that's what I think threw us off with things like Meltdown and Spectre, right? Because it was happening at the base, it was happening at the base level, what Bruce calls class breaks, right? I mean, everything breaks at once. And so we think we've got, you know, you have to be this tall and then to do a kind of attack, and it turns out those kinds of assumptions aren't as true as we thought. On the trade flows, I suspect you know more than me, so maybe we're going to have to catch up on that. But I think I think it's right, and I like where are these areas where we can take, you know, where, as we've said, where can we take these analogies and these mindsets from the other areas and how we've solved these and bring them over? One that I really push is to try and convince Washington, D.C. to get out of this warfare mindset and start saying, imagine the kinds of solutions that unlock in our minds if we think about this as an environmental problem. 100 years ago, Canada successfully sued the United States. It was called the Trail Smelter case because pollution from a smelter went across the border from, I think, Washington State into Canada, and it killed vegetation, and they sued because there was this emissions from our country that crossed the border. Boy, you could, and as an interesting lawyer, come up with an interesting case of how emissions from one country were affecting your other country. What would it mean to have cap and trade? If you're an ISP, you can have this, or an AS, you can have this much botnet traffic or other hazardous emissions, but if you have more than that, we're going to tax you on the rest, or you have to buy a license from someone else. Maybe that's a crappy idea, but at least it's starting to think about what are these other mindsets that we can use.
Let me just say,
maybe it's a great idea.
As an international trade lawyer, we've been there, and we have a few ideas on what are the externalities. I mean, the international trading system was established. The rule framework, you have to accept that there are externalities from national actions, and that's why you want a rule framework. If you think that only your economy matters, or that you can control all the externalities, you won't want to create those international rule frameworks. So I think the whole system has recognized that fact. I personally would say to you that TPP is the most sophisticated framework that we've seen around the digital economy, cross-border effects, but it's still pretty limited. You know, it's talking about no taxation of e-commerce. It's talking about, you know, no mandatory source code access and no data localization requirements. And those are good things, but they are, you know, they're building blocks, I think, towards, and of course, even those things are not ones that all of our important trading partners could agree to. So there's a lot of work to be done. So what a fantastic conversation, and audience, please join me in thanking Bruce for being with us. And
Thank you.
Thank you. Nicely done. Sorry.
I think we have a few minutes if others want to congregate, as well as perhaps a reception.
Yeah, let's
Is
go
that
out, let's
right?
go, let's go out there where there's more room.
And it's a reception for, I think, 3 or maybe even 4 of the different SIPA student groups that are involved, and so please talk to the students.
Thank you so much. It was very, yeah, it was really good fun.
Hey, good seeing you.